Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, doctor. Hello.
Hello. How is everyone?
We are fine, thank you, doctor.
Good, good. You tell me when we can start. Should we wait for a few minutes, 5 minutes, or do we start?
I think maybe wait.
Okay, we wait a bit.
Or
let's
2
wait
minutes.
for 5 minutes. Yeah, let's wait 5 minutes and then we start.
Okay.
We'll mute and. Should we start?
Yes, I think that.
Okay, let's start. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let's start. So good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, doctor.
Good afternoon, doctor.
Good afternoon. Hello, hello. So today we will continue with the lectures on advanced wastewater treatment. Today, so last week we talked about the removal of some compounds, in that case, contaminants of emerging concern, and they needed certain doses of, for example, UV ozone to be removed. That's one of the applications. The second application, and maybe even more important, is the removal of pathogens. And that's what we are going to talk today in this lecture. So it's about the removal of pathogens from water using certain disinfection methods. So, but first, I want to present to you what are pathogens. So to refresh, also to complete certain information that might be missing and be in the same, let's say, in the same context. The first question is related to what are pathogens. Well, pathogens are different types of microorganisms that can cause a disease. These microorganisms can be, for example, of enteric nature, or also called enteric pathogens. And these are pathogens, these are microorganisms that can grow in the enteric tract and can sometimes be excreted with the feces. So in general, these are of major concern because they can lead to the propagation of different types of diseases. And the main source, because of that, because they can be incubated or they can live in the enteric tract, the main source of them tends to be the wastewater, the sewage, or in some cases, an inadequate access to sanitation. And from that perspective, and due to the holistic, due to the different stages in the water cycle, that the water cycle is always interconnected, there are the risks that also these pathogens, despite that they are mostly present in the wastewater, there is also the risk that they tend to be present also in the drinking water network. But the main source could be the sewage or the wastewater. So because of that, if they are present in the drinking water, then this can become a major public health issue. And that's why it's important to take appropriate measures in order to be able to get rid, or at least to inactivate, these enteric organisms. From that perspective, we can split them based on mostly their physiology or the nature. We can split them in about 5 different types of pathogens. The first ones that are called prions, they cannot be reproduced in the environment. They can infect, or they need to infect, certain bacteria or other organisms, the same like the viruses. So they start to inject, or they transfer the DNA to the host, usually bacteria or different types of cells. And once they infect the cells, then they start to reproduce not only those cells, but also they start to reproduce the viruses or the prions. And that's how these types of microorganisms will dissipate, how they are going to be replicate and populate different stages. The next level are bacteria. Bacteria that are pretty much also related to different types of diseases that are way larger. They can reproduce themselves, and they can be different types of bacteria with different properties that can lead to also a different array of diseases. We can also have protozoa. These protozoa are the smallest microorganisms that can be present. So the smallest, let's say, between brackets, animals, very tiny organisms, like for example, amoeba, and they are also linked to serious diseases. And last but not least, we also have different types of worms. They are generally described as helminths, and most of the times helminth X, because that's the way how they tend to replicate and dissipate in different environments. And these worms also live in the intestinal tract, in the enteric tract, being, or in this case, these worms tend to host human beings, tend to live within the intestines of the human beings, directly infecting and affecting the way how our, in this case, digestive system works. So these are some examples. So we can have the viruses that they are also a bit in between what we can consider to be alive and what we can consider to be just like more a biochemical element. But this viruses still is a bit the question whether they are really alive or not. What is more or less known is that they do not can, or they cannot reproduce themselves, and that's why they need bacteria. And then here in the center we can see some bacteria. These bacteria, different types, different elements, different also ways of how they can replicate, either by a mitosis or meiosis, duplicating, and doing it in a very fast pace. So some of these viruses, bacteria, can within a few days of incubation already infect a human being, or not also a human being, but also certain different types of animals, like for example, cattle, poultry, and then once they get infected by these bacteria, either the viruses either by the viruses or by the bacteria, and we eat these or products that proceed from these different types of animals, that is fortunately, because then we can get this type of bacteria or viruses, and we can get also infected. The same happens with the parasites. With this is a worm. They mostly replicate by laying certain types of eggs, and the most common way to get infected with the parasite is when the human being consumes the vegetables, the food infected, or where these eggs are, and they reach our organism in that manner. So different types of photos, different types of elements, also, or different sizes that can be transferred. And this is one of the major public health issues, because along the years and in the history, there have been several cases of main infections, of major infections, pandemics, that have affected the public health. And not to or not to go that far, where we have just experienced the latest pandemic due to the presence of certain coronavirus. And well, we know what this can, or how this can affect the different activities. But in many years, in particular during the Middle Age, when the sanitation systems were not completely developed, were not completely in place. The cases of the pandemics were much more pronounced, they were much more frequent, and the risks were so high that a lot of people could hardly live more than 40, 50 years. So the life expectancy was very short. And not only the adults didn't have a very long life expectancy, but also kids, children, infants, they many of them died within the very first days or weeks after they were born, and some others couldn't survive after after they turned 10 years old because of the outbreak of different types of diseases, among them, for example, the cholera. So one of the main ways to transfer these diseases or how these diseases have proliferated is via water. And that's why they are called waterborne pathogens, meaning that they find in the water one of the ideal means to be transferred from one organism that was infected or has been infected to another one that hasn't or hadn't been infected yet. And that's how this route moves much faster. In many cases, it can be a transfer, or it can be originated by humans, but we cannot also roll out, and animals may also have their contribution to this route, going from, for example, the fecal origin to um, um, the oral consumption of either water or certain food. Some examples of these waterborne pathogens where we can talk about the Salmonella, hepatitis A, or the transfer of Cryptosporidium. So these water-based pathogens, well, some are microorganisms that can cause diseases that grow mostly in water. Some of the most common cases are, for example, the Legionella. Certain microorganisms that they prefer to live at relatively moderate temperatures, mostly in cooling systems, and they cause a certain type of pneumonia. And it's not only, so this is a good example showing that it's not only affecting the enteric tract, is not only affecting the digestive system, it can also be transmitted by water, but affecting other parts of the body, like for example the lungs, and because of that causing severe inflammation of the lungs, and in many cases, unfortunately, strong diseases that can lead to death. Some others could be also the Pseudomonas that prefer to live at higher temperatures, or the Mycobacterium avium that is mostly living in different types of birds, and it's transferred also via the consumption of water. Depending on their size, well, we can also talk about different sizes of these microorganisms. This can also provide certain idea of what could be the best way to remove them. So we can have the helminth eggs, that many of them can be visible with the bird eye. The helminth eggs that can have a size of sometimes even 1 millimeter. So we can physically, we can see the helminth eggs. Of course, it's always better to use a microscope to, in addition to not only identify it, but also to assess the structure and how active or inactive that helminth egg is after certain, in particular after certain treatment method. We can also have a protozoa that they are a bit smaller. In this case, they are not easily, or they cannot be easily seen. They have a size that ranges between 1 micron and 100 microns. Still, in some cases, the larger ones can be seen with the bird eye. Then we have bacteria that they cannot be seen directly with the bird eye, with the sizes that range or go from 100 nanometers to 10 micrometers. And then we get into the range of the viruses, smaller than 100 nanometers between 10 and 100 nanometers, and then the viruses that are pretty small, smaller than 1 nanometer. You remember from our previous lecture, we were talking about the microfiltration or different types of methods, physical methods. We talked about microfiltration, we talked about nanofiltration, and also mentioned something about reverse osmosis. When we were talking about the membranes and the size of the pores. So based on the size of these different microorganisms, you can see that the microfilters that they have a pore size of between, let's say, 1 to 10 microns. So they will not be able to allow organisms larger than 1 to 10 microns. Then they will retain most of the helminth eggs, a bit of protozoa, a bit of bacteria. If we use a nanofiltration, then we're going to be in the range of between 10 nanometers and 1 micrometer. So without nanofiltration, we can remove a lot of bacteria and also some viruses. But then further than that, to really be able to remove also the very small microorganisms or organisms, the prions, then we need to apply reverse osmosis. However, these methods of filtration, advanced filtration methods with membranes, they are or tend to be a bit expensive, in some cases not readily accessible for different locations, not only because of the costs that they have, but also because of the operational costs, so how expensive it is to operate these systems. When we start to talk about the microorganisms that affect or are mostly related to the spread of different diseases, then we can talk about, for example, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Shigella, Escherichia coli, Yersinia enterocolitica, Helicobacter pylori, Mycobacteria, and Listeria monocytogenes. These are different organisms that cause very different types of diseases. Well, Salmonella, this very specific type of sort of diarrhea. Salmonella, also linked to a high level or degree of impact related to health, or the Helicobacter pylori that can leave a very low pH in the stomach and is also very much related to the different cases of acidity, certain ulcers that can grow in the stomach of people. So when we talk about Salmonella, well, I mentioned they can be like a specific case, but there are more than 2,000 different types of serotypes of the Salmonella. Still, in many countries, like in the USA and Europe, is still the second most common cause of foodborne illness. They tend to contaminate mostly beef and chicken, but also certain foods like tomatoes, also very much linked with the distribution of eggs. And this Salmonella can regrow in compost sewage sludge. So if this Salmonella is present in the wastewater, and if the wastewater is not well treated, not well disinfected, then the chances that they reach the drinking water network, because we are working, or we have very closed, so to speak, water cycles, that is that they contaminate also the drinking water network, are relatively high. We have the Campylobacter. There are two major species that are important and related to diseases: the Campylobacter sejuni and the Campylobacter coli. Also very common in United States and Europe. Many of them related with the cells of chicken. Not that much with vegetables. They can cause, or they are very much mostly related also with the use of or the consumption of drinking water that has not been well treated. However, these Campylobacter, they are not as strong as Salmonella or Escherichia coli, so they may not be that dangerous because of their relatively lower persistence occurrence in water, but they cannot be rolled out. We have also the Shigella, very much related to Shigella, to Salmonella. These organisms are mostly generated by the human beings themselves. They can replicate that fast, that they can infect, and they reproduce that fast, that they can infect people relatively faster. So it is sufficient that just a few of these cells get into a human being to quickly reproduce and cause a major infection. They are not that common in the environment, so they can survive very hardly in just the normal environments, but they are the second most important cause of diseases in some, for example, swimming pools, recreational locations, areas in, for example, the United States. Escherichia coli, in particular, the strain 0157 H7, they are mostly present in beef when somebody consumes beef. Because of that, or because they are mostly hosting cattle, then cattle manure is one of the significant sources in terms, or for the cases of surface water. So in those areas where there is a lot of cattle, and after there is certain runoff, and then the runoff comes and flushes the cattle areas, the agricultural areas, then this E. coli can be flushed and reach the surface water bodies, and that's how, if that water is used for drinking water, that's how they can get in contact with the human beings. As mentioned before, Helicobacter pylori, they are a very common cause of the most common ulcer. They can survive at very low pH, sometimes pH of even 1 to 2. They can be transmitted from person to person, but the most common way to transmit them is the consumption of raw vegetables, water that has not been disinfected, either drinking water or of water from swimming pools that have not been properly disinfected, those that have a low concentration of, for example, chlorine, or that they have not been exposed to certain disinfection methods, then they can be easily torn into contamination focuses. But in many cases, the most common one is the consumption of drinking water. I think we have just 10 more minutes, so I will try to close with certain extra information. Afterwards, we can take a short break to change just to the next Zoom link. So when we are talking about the viruses, the most dangerous viruses that can be transferred via water are enteroviruses, like the polio, ecovirus, for example. There are like 100 different types of these viruses. Hepatitis A, Rio and rotaviruses, adenoviruses, between 51 toroviruses, the hepatitis E also, and some others. So these are the viruses that are much more dangerous for the uncommonly seen for the human being. And these viruses, well, now in the last couple of years, we have seen several photos of different types of viruses. Well, these are micro photographies obtained of these organisms. This is a photo of a micro photography of a poliovirus type 1. But they can cause different types of diseases, like respiratory diseases. In very extreme cases, they can lead to meningitis when the temperature is relatively high. When the conditions are not that strong, just a mild, they have a mild effect, but still we can have certain hand, foot, or mouth diseases, mostly of the skin. But in extreme cases, they can lead to paralysis or even mental disorders, depending on how strong the virus is. And partially this is caused by the fact that they may not only infect, as mentioned before, they may not only infect the enteric tract, but they also move within the body, reaching different organs like the lungs or even the brain. And that's how they can lead to these extreme effects related to paralysis or mental disorders. We have the case of the hepatitis A virus that mostly affects the liver. It causes certain malfunction of the liver, a strong inflammation, and well, the liver is essential organ in our body, so this can be of a main concern because of the importance of the liver. So hepatitis A transmitted by or through the water. It is a virus that contains RNA. So these microorganisms use the RNA to replicate by hosting certain cells. This hepatitis A virus is relatively resistant or apparently a bit more thermal resistant than some other viruses, and can have a stronger survival or longer survival mode on foods and water than most of the other enteric viruses. This is a rotavirus. Rotaviruses, they have a double strain RNA. They are very common cause of infection in kids, in particular causing gastroenteritis. They can be easily transmitted via the consumption of drinking water that has not been properly disinfected or food that has not been well cleaned, washed. And interestingly, they are mostly commonly seen during winter or in temperate climates. So these rotaviruses, they are not easily seen at high temperature, mostly at lower temperatures when they tend to be seen. And because of these conditions, well, I have discussed or mentioned before, we can use membrane filtration, nanofiltration, ultrafiltration, or if possible, reverse osmosis processes to remove them. That, or the main reason to use this filtration, is because of the size, to have a physical separation, removal of these organisms from water. However, these membrane processes, though they can be very effective, they may not be easily available to different regions because of the equipment cost, not only the amount of money needed to install these systems, but also the cost related to the operation, because they need quite some energy for the pumping of the water, and also the cleaning of the different units. So because of that, membrane filtration is one of the possibilities. There are a few, but the most applied ones are disinfection processes. And most of the disinfection processes are based on the addition of certain or a strong oxidant, for example, chlorine, or another elements that have a different chemical composition that also have a very strong oxidant effect, like ozone, or they can be disinfected with the supplied exposure to certain wavelengths that can directly inactivate the DNA of the organisms, therefore limiting the way how they can reproduce among them. If they can reproduce, then that's how we can limit their propagation in the living beings. Do you have questions before we change the Zoom link? Questions, comments?
No. Thank you, doctor. Thank you.
Do we stop and get the link again so we continue?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Stop
Okay.
stop and get a link.
I will
again.
stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay. So we use the same link, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah. Thank you.